So what does it mean? What does it mean to make room for conservatives here at the Ethical Society and in your life? Some ethical culture leader colleagues of mine have already reflected on this, and you can read their essays on the AEU website under the button that says Resources. It's called Reflections. It's a journal of ethical culture leaders. So I thank many of them for sharing their ideas with me. I thank some of you for sharing your ideas for me. Now, as I wade into this discussion of political labels like conservative and liberal, I'm aware that labels can be useful. You need them, you use them, but they can also inhibit understanding and dialogue. They can oversimplify and polarize. They can become rigid boxes that we try to stuff people into, fit them into it, but they're really just conventions used to understand reality. Now, I'm going to probably oversimplify today, but I'm trying to do it in a way that will be useful in discussions as we move forward. So I'm going to try to rely on an article of over 100 years ago by Percival Chubb. Percival Chubb was the ethical culture leader at the Ethical Society of St. Louis from 1911 to 1933. And he wrote that we should free ourselves from the tyranny of catchwords and the popular classifications. So as I use catchwords and popular classifications, I'm going to try to use them in a way that helps us escape intellectual tyranny. Now, labels are particularly dangerous because of the human tendency to form tribes, right? I've heard people come here and say often that they have quite, quote, found their tribe. And I kind of like that. But then I also feel uncomfortable with it. Because I don't know if I want to be a member of a tribe. Richard Canary wrote in Reflections, at ethical societies can feel like we're talking to the choir. Right? I mean, we share our beliefs here and values with one another, and quite often people nod in agreement. Not always, but usually. Tribes can create polarization. They can create a sense of us versus them. They can create the image of the other, an archetype of somebody who is foreign, different, often dangerous. And tribes can create the image of an enemy. So they can inhibit our benevolent and universal hopes for social unity, which many ethical culturists feel is a very high part of our ideal system. Tribes can lead us to care exclusively for our tribe, our team, and not about the worth of every human being, which to me is the heart of ethical humanism. So here at the Ethical Society, do we care about the worth of every person? Do we care about each other as beings of inherent worth, regardless of our political positions? Given the frenzy that we're going through politically and the media frenzy, it's harder and harder to say that we do. We don't always. Again, your leader emeritus Richard suggests that we consider, quote, the concerns of society members, this society members, who get tired of our political correctness and start to feel alienated. I mean, liberals don't like it when we're accused of being politically correct or called snowflakes, which I still don't understand. In the media, conservatives use the term political correctness as almost a club to beat up progressives and liberals. Now, 40 years ago, I tried to start understanding these labels like liberal and conservative by studying 20th century and 19th century U.S. history. In college, I came to understand those labels, liberal and conservative, as being full of inner contradictions. Both terms are complicated and inconsistent. They change over time. But these internal contradictions confuse us as we get mired in the culture wars today. So I'm going to try to tease these out. I found it useful to understand conservative and liberal by looking at how both groups try to solve social problems. Quite often, not always, I found it useful to appreciate that conservatives and liberals differ on this. Conservatives, particularly protective of individual freedom and liberty, often think that social problems should be solved through individual effort. Liberals, often more collectivist by nature, try to solve problems cooperatively, often through the government. These general tendencies are apparent regarding a number of issues, like gun violence. Conservatives often will say they want good guys with guns to solve the problem of gun violence, whereas liberals often will say they want coordinated government action. Environmental degradation, conservatives will say that they still believe that individual ingenuity, perhaps in engineering, and the free market and individual thoughts will solve that problem, whereas liberals want more of a collective solution like regulation. It's more complicated, but that's the framework that I'm going to play with today. So let me go into more detail about starting with conservatives. Jonathan Haidt, an interesting author, said that self-identified conservatives often differ from liberals in that conservatives embrace certain values that liberals do not as much. He has a list of values. And both conservatives and liberals, he claims, score very high on these two values: fairness and protection from harm. That's what his studies showed. But he also showed that conservatives also label authority, order, and loyalty as pretty high on the scale as well, and liberals don't so much. So these are conservative values because they tend to conserve existing social structures. They reinforce the current distribution of power. Loyalty, order, authority would do that, right? So conservatives also seem, according to Haidt's research, to distrust change, especially change that might foment revolution or anarchy. So regarding economics, conservatives will often support the free market. They believe that individuals, if they're allowed to operate freely, will get most of their needs met through supply and demand. They say that government should remain small, intervening only occasionally when the free market needs a slight adjustment. So for conservatives, the best government is the government which governs the least, certainly involving the economy. And this phrase about governing least, which is often associated with Jefferson, connects this with a fear of authoritarian government, despotism from the left or the right. Now, the United States revolted against a particularly despotic England. Parliament and the king were powerful and proud, and they treated the colonies like children that needed to be controlled. So it's tie that in with this sense of moral purity that the British Empire had, that they were bringing light to the world. And you get this brushing off of colonial demands. So American revolutionaries chose freedom and liberty over an authoritarian government. And contemporary conservatives like to remind us of this very true historical fact. Even the American Revolution was, to a degree, conservative. The people who were mainly in power before the Revolution were in power after the Revolution, other than a group of loyalists who went back to England during the Revolutionary War. Those with money before the Revolution had money after the Revolution. It was a rejection of the French model of revolution and the danger of ideologically extreme mass rebellion. Now, the United States offered a constitutional and social middle ground, a moderate alternative between imperial dictatorship and the Paris Commune. And similarly, this moderate perspective seemed more attractive as we witnessed the excesses of communist revolutions in Russia and China and numerous satellites. Communism proved both brutal and unsustainable, especially in the minds of conservatives. So over 100 years ago, Percival Chubb explained that conservatism about radical politics was there well before communism. In his essay, The Conservative and Liberal Aspects of Ethical Religion, written at the beginning of the last century, Chubb identifies two types of conservatism that I'm going to focus on. The conservatism of disenchantment and the conservatism of selfishness. So the conservatism of disenchantment is skeptical of idealism and grand schemes for social engineering. Rather than being enchanted with the notion of the perfectibility of mankind that fueled extremism both in fascism and in communism, the conservatism of disenchantment is wary of the darker side of human nature, especially when it's compounded with mass psychology and stifling bureaucracy. This conservatism condemned communism and fascism for this ugly hubris that doomed both regimes to be cruel and unsuitable and unsustainable. It criticizes also leftist and liberal and progressive blind faith in social engineering. George Will, conservative columnist, wrote, "Forever seeking the Archimedean levers for prying the world in directions they prefer, progressives press on towards their goal of diminishing America's individualism in order to make them more amenable to collectivism." But a second type of conservatism that Chubb outlines is less about rejecting social engineering than it's about protecting private property and privilege. So what Chubb calls the conservatism of selfishness accepts economic hierarchy and the liberty of the rich to get richer. The conservatism of selfishness, quote, fears change because it may endanger vested interests or personal convenience. It does so by claiming that the powerful got to be powerful as a result of hard work and talent and maybe God's blessings. And so underlying that aspect of conservatism of selfishness is the assumption also that one's interest is naturally opposed to the interests of all other people, making collectivism and the common good unrealistic ideals. But beyond these political and economic categories suggested by Chubb, I think conservatism is also, in the long stream of American history, more associated with intolerance towards people without traditional social mores. So, conservative traditions within the social sphere tend to see cultural patterns and attitudes and personality traits as very important and of a particular conservative nature. Political theorist Michael Openshut wrote, "To be conservative is to prefer the familiar to the unknown, to prefer the tried to the untried, fact to mystery, the actual to the possible, the limited to the unbounded, the near to the distant, the sufficient to the superabundant, the convenient to the perfect, present laughter to utopian bliss." An interesting series of opposites. So for many conservatives, their resistance to deviating from social norms is based on an assumption of God's law, or, for more secular conservatives, of natural law. The interpretation of how things are is then made to be how they should be. So they derive their ethics in a way from their metaphysics. They get their ought out of their is, as David Hume would say. Now, often these beliefs are rigid and intolerant of many ways of being human. Conservatives often condemn all sorts of behavior they deem as unacceptable. Now remember, I'm talking broad category. Not all conservatives believe this. But often the beliefs are rigid and intolerant. They condemn things like masturbation on an extreme sense, sex before marriage, sex out of the faith, LGBTQ orientation, transgender, or pansexual identities, drug use, and so on. Now, obviously, these are tied to a degree to a historical suspicion of this physical world, especially to bodily pleasure. And these have historical roots. Jonathan Haidt suggests that the intolerance is connected to a concept of disgust. He suggests that the emotion of disgust may have evolved when people became meat eaters and had to distinguish what they could or couldn't eat to survive, and then spread to other areas of social life, leading to ostracism of people who they see as unclean or contaminated in some way. Haidt noted, interestingly enough, that in most of the world outside of the United States, and especially outside of liberal circles, people often tie disgust to ethical condemnation. So that their ooh, that's gross, is tied to their ethics more. Quite often that's connected to something on the opposite side of disgust or contamination, and that's purity. The value of purity is seen as a conservative value. It goes from food to sexual mores. It supports ideas of virginity or chastity. It implies the importance of self-control, especially the denial of physical pleasures. Now, in societies where there's sufficient social pressure to keep these rules in place, I mean, think about like the Puritan village of New England 250 years ago or so, you don't need government to step in because there's so much social pressure to conform from the family on down. But as America got more diverse and filled with people of different aesthetic and ethical assumptions, conservatives became more and more challenged. Growing hedonistic lifestyles made conservatives more uncomfortable. And from the Civil War forward, especially, some conservatives turned to government to uphold intolerant ethical frameworks. Sometimes that include racially discriminatory laws, laws against contraception, laws against obscenity, pornography, the prohibition of alcohol and drugs. Now, curiously, many of those causes were also held by progressives. But that's a whole other explanation. I'll get to that later. What comes to the fore about modern conservatism in general now is a philosophical contradiction. While conservatism argues for small government and laissez-faire policies regarding economics, it often uses government to reach into personal and private lives of citizens to regulate what we do with our bodies. Now, liberals have a similar but opposite contradiction. Liberals generally do not impose their aesthetic ethics regarding personal behavior and what people do with their bodies. Liberals tend to find the customs and practices of their others, maybe they're different, they might say they're not to my own liking, but they don't want government to step in and regulate that personal behavior. And that's tied to Haidt's notion that he saw in his research that, quote, educated liberals are the only group to say, I find that disgusting, but it doesn't make it wrong. I think there's a lot there. Do you agree with that? So as a result, liberals tend to be more culturally tolerant of diverse lifestyles and choices. They don't see pleasure as sinful as often. They want government out of the bedrooms, respectful of social autonomy and agency. And this is partially connected to the fact that liberals are less inclined to value divine or natural law more than individual choice. Liberals often reject essentialism. Essentialism is the belief that there's some necessary fixed human nature or gender roles that need to be protected and maintained. Liberals are more likely to accept new and diverse ways of being human. So whereas conservatives prefer stability, safety, tradition, and order, liberals prefer change. They see change as more of an opportunity than a threat. Liberals rank much higher on one personality trait that Haidt calls openness to experience. They're more likely to crave novelty, variety, new ideas. And again, unlike conservatives, liberals don't need a government to resist the change or to maintain traditional social and sexual paradigms. But liberals do call for government intervention regarding economic and political planning. It was the economic chaos of the Gilded Age that generated the progressive movement to begin with. They rejected a conservative faith in laissez-faire policies because 19th century capitalism was so cruelly obvious to everybody. They sent slaughtering Native Americans, sending children into mines to get coal, putting women in sweatshops over and over again. So progressives demanded government regulation. One of my favorite governors in history is Bob La Follette of Wisconsin. He was the first person to begin to create commissions, staffed government commissions of independent experts drawn from a lot of the land-grant universities that were founded in the late 1800s in order to rationalize industry, to protect laborers and protect consumers from the ravages of social Darwinism. And progressives moved from the city to the state to the national level, and Teddy Kennedy brought it into the White House, saying an active government was necessary. He said, a great democracy has got to be progressive or it will soon cease to be a democracy. He saw the government necessary as a role as reforming economics. So liberals use egalitarian phrases like the common good, a new Robert Wright book that I'm going to read. And he promoted broader distribution of resources. The primatologist Franz de Waal put it this way. He said, it's obvious that liberals emphasize the common good. Safety laws for coal mines, health care for all, poor support for the poor, that are not nearly as well recognized by conservatives. Now, progressives and liberals are closely aligned. Both believe that individual economic rights can be curbed to serve the greater good and to create a more egalitarian America. I mean, the progressives were the ones that passed the first income tax. It didn't exist till about 100 years ago. The belief that we can infringe on your pocketbook to serve the common good. So while liberals want government not to interfere in personal and social freedoms, it wants government more active in regulating economic life. So both conservatives and liberals want some parts of life to be left alone and other parts to have government get involved with. But liberals want an economically active government and a socially tolerant government, whereas conservatives want an economically passive government deferring to industry leaders, but an interventionist government regarding personal private choices. Now, conservatives want government to intervene if a mother, for example, decides to choose an abortion, and they resist, however, broader ways to help through like vaccination programs or child welfare systems or a strong public school system. So there's this tension. Now, I have overgeneralized for the last 15 minutes, and I'm not even going to talk about libertarians who in some way are more consistent in wanting government to be small, both regarding personal choices and regarding the economy. And that's a whole other talk as well. But I think the two frames are useful to see both liberals and conservatives has this tension regarding government involvement. Now, I return to the question. Is there room for conservatives in ethical culture? And what does that mean? Before I tell you, I do want to admit that our founder, Felix Adler, the very stern portrait on the stairwells tells you this, had some very conservative social beliefs. For example, he growing up in a religious home, he went to Germany to pursue his PhD program, and he found that German social life was way too hedonistic. In fact, his classmates poked fun at him for not joining them in the pubs and the brothels of German life, which was very common, especially among the well-to-do. Adler embraced some rather traditional gender roles, which is one reason why it wasn't until the last 30 years that women were as equal as men in clergy leader roles in ethical culture. And he also saw marriage as a sacred bond that should never be broken. So he opposed divorce. When he founded the New York Society for Ethical Culture, he also, in his founding speech, took on this pursuit of pleasure that some of the conservatives echo a discomfort with. He said, he spoke out against the hot and hasty pursuit of pleasure, the bazaars of fashion and festive halls that we wander, chewing artificial phrases as we breathe the stale air and insipid perfume, and enjoy the brief exhilaration of the dance, the physical stimulus of wine and food, the nervous excitement of a game of hazard. To Adler, there is something demeaning about the constant quest for what he calls parties of pleasure. So there's a conservative element in him there. Now, I recently read an article by Saadi Hamid in the February 20th edition of The Atlantic entitled The Rise of Anti-Liberalism. Hamid commented about a dystopian novel by Michael Houellebecq called Submission. And in the book, according to Hamid, it's a meditation on the aimlessness of late-stage Western liberalism, where there is nothing much to believe in and nothing much to fight for except the never-ending expansion of personal freedom. He suggests that maybe liberalism, with its, quote, aimlessness and moral chaos, is not the unmitigated good most of us are raised to believe it is. Hamid also referenced a book by Patrick Deeman called Why Liberalism Failed, which critiques liberalism's goal of freeing individuals from, quote, any limiting conditions. He said that this is a liberty that celebrates not freedom from our most basest desires, but freedom to pursue our most basest desires. It proposed an endless free choice that he said was a dead end. Adler shared a lot of that perspective. To live a noble life, according to Adler, one had to live for higher goals than one's own pleasure. Adler was suspicious of our proclivity towards hedonism. But he didn't call upon the collective or the government to manage that. Unlike conservatives, and more like liberals, he wanted the government mainly to step in to deal with protecting people from ruthless capitalism. So in 1876, he saw that, quote, "the rudder of the ship has ceased to move obedient to the helm, and we are drifting on a seething tide of business, each one absorbed in holding his own in the giddy race of competition." So he had a problem with economic capitalism. The race for competition was harming innocent men and women, and especially children, and that's why Adler dove into children's issues. He founded the first free kindergarten in the United States, the Working Men's School, the Child Study Association. He was on the National Child Labor Committee, and he worked to end child labor. He learned a lot about Jane Addams and her theories in her really applied progressivism in Hull House in Chicago. Addams got the attention of the Chicago political elite by pointing out that no longer was it possible for a mother to raise her child by herself. She needed the city to step in and clean up the streets and the alleyways that were the playgrounds for the children so they wouldn't be hurt. Industrialization and urbanization required engaged progressive politics. That was Adams' conclusion. And Adler and other progressives saw that rugged individualism was no longer working. The colonial frontier was gone. Private charity couldn't keep up with the complexities of this. Crowded cities and our interconnected lives needed collective solutions. And Adams said, private beneficence is totally inadequate to deal with the vast number of the cities disinherited. That's still the case today. Combined with ethical culture's progressive legacy, it affects how I view our role as a community and a movement today. I mean, we are facing severe threats to our communities and to our nation, to the planet. So this conservative mantra of small government only, for me, falls flat, personally. For many economic and political issues, we need cooperative solutions more than ever. So like with gun control, the Second Amendment was born out of the belief that given the dangers of authoritarian government and foreign powers, people had to have guns to protect themselves. But it seems clear that given our military, we don't use guns to fight our foreign adversaries, and it's pretty clear that gun violence is more the danger than our own government. People will disagree, but guns and people desperate enough to use them have become the enemy in my mind. So we need a well-conceived collective solution. Same thing with health care. It seems clearer now that Americans don't want pure laissez-faire approaches. We don't want homeless people dying on our streets. We don't want people kicked out of emergency rooms because they can't afford to pay. We need things like inoculations that are based in science and preventative care, and it serves us more in the long run. Regarding the environment, except for that very small group of climate deniers that are getting more and more powerful, we need collective solutions. Melting ice caps, rising temperatures demand some form of cooperative ventures. Public education. We're coming to understand that we need an educated public with skills that are employable in order to serve the public good, make criminal lifestyles less necessary. And there's lots of room for debate on the issue of charter school vouchers. We know that we need to educate all Americans, and it's doubtful that the private sector is going to do that. So there still has to be a functioning, strong public school system. Regarding our current distribution of resources, I think we need moderate reforms or we risk greater public unrest. I reject Marxist determinism, but I think we can agree that it's not good and people have nothing to lose but their chains. And more people are feeling that way, at the edge of desperation. It might not be necessary to support grand-scale socialism, but unless the 99% have more, maybe through empowerment zones, small business incentives, they can be conservative solutions. But something involving government intervention is necessary if we're going to escape the dangers of opioids and heroin and crack on our streets and crimes of desperation. So I'm going to bring this talk to a conclusion I think I've made my liberal leanings clear, but that shouldn't surprise too many people. But hopefully I've explained why I think the labels are tricky and how tribalism oversimplifies arguments and excludes others. And we're really suffering from this. We are demonizing each other. We're making enemies in our own society. We can still energetically debate the issues, but I hope we remember the inherent worth of every person. I think it might be easier to do that if we remember an aspect of humanism that I talked about a couple of weeks ago. Doubt, skepticism. That's the heart of humanism. If we can temper what can be an ugly smugness on both sides of the political debate, to avoid the self-righteousness and cultivate a little moral humility, I think we'll do better. Ethical culture leader Arthur Dobrin admits that, quote, not all change is positive, not everything modern is an advance. It is possible that at least some of today's progressive positions will be seen as retrograde by future generations. He continues, certainty has no more place in ethical movement than does quietism. Certainty has no more place in ethical movement than does quietism. As long as some people truly believe, as long as someone truly believes in the dignity of each person, honors the uniqueness of every individual, and lives in such a way as to bring out the best in others, that's a hell of a lot, I admit. But as long as they do that, it doesn't matter if they're a conservative or not. As a self-proclaimed liberal in ethical culture, I seek out aspects of conservatism that contain wisdom. For example, in conservatism, what I consider, there is a healthy skepticism about embracing pleasure as the ultimate and only goal of life. Maybe it's from my Puritan upbringing, perhaps it is. I think I've gotten a little bit away from that. But maybe liberalism contributed to what we have now as a crass consumerism, the heightened emphasis on individuals and the desire to buy and get more stuff. Maybe values associated with conservatism like self-control, restraint, individual responsibility are important as a part of our social matrix. And maybe there's some truth in the words of Edmund Burke that the restraints on men and women as well as their liberties are to be reckoned among their rights. Maybe James Croft is right when he says, quote, there are certain liberal orthodoxies which go unquestioned within ethical culture. He's a leader of the St. Louis Ethical Society. He says, there are some things that go unquestioned that deserve to be challenged so that we can learn and grow. And one of our core principles is intellectual openness. We have to guard against becoming less so. If we're to be true to our liberal perspective and progressive traditions, we need to be more open to the fact that our tradition contained conservatism as well. Our political opponents were members of ethical culture. It may be that my own thinking is too dominated by the assumption that we should always seek cooperative solutions and government answers. Sometimes problems are outside of the scope of government to solve. So maybe I need to engage conversations with conservatives by saying, which problems are best left for individuals to solve and which problems require a collectivist solution? At least there's a slice of an opening to a conversation there. So in the end, I believe that there is room for conservatism in ethical culture, particularly those who embrace the conservatism of disenchantment. A conservatism that's skeptical of government solutions to social problems. Not bigoted positions, but people who honestly believe that government solutions don't always work. And here, in the ethical society, I think Richard is right in saying that our choir and our team and our tribe should be more open to rational conservatives who accept ethical humanism's commitment to social justice, but from a conservative perspective. More importantly, he was right in saying that such an approach would, quote, not only express our commitment to the intrinsic worth of everyone, but also create an internal environment in ethical societies that will make them better places in which our members can grow politically, emotionally, and spiritually. It might help us not only become more tolerant and inclusive, but more effective at making the world a little bit better. Thank you very much.